My name is Abigail Turner. I am 67 years old. I spent most of my life working as a part-time accountant and keeping a home full of love. This brick house was the center of everything for my late husband Frank and me. Every holiday, every stormy night, every milestone in our children's lives happened right here. Tonight should have been about honoring him, his birthday, his favorite meal. The table was set with our best china. Candles flickered along the table runner. Old friends from the neighborhood filled the chairs. There was the smell of beef stew in the air, the same recipe Frank used to ask for every winter. I even set his chair at the end of the table, though it stayed empty. We had just finished singing Happy Birthday. Laughter was still echoing when Greg, my eldest son, pushed back his chair and stood. He tapped his glass with the edge of his spoon. He smiled a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Then he said it. "Pack your bags, old lady. This house is going up for sale." The room went still for a heartbeat. Then, shockingly, a handful of people clapped. Glasses were lifted in a mock toast. From the corner, I saw Earl, a local real estate agent, smirking as if a deal had just been closed. Lydia, my son's wife, rested her manicured hand on my shoulder. The cold press of her nails felt like a warning. I looked down. My fingers had been gripping the corner of Frank's handkerchief inside my jacket pocket. It was worn thin from years of use, the fabric soft, almost silky. Frank used to carry it every day, folded neatly in the left pocket of his slacks. I had slipped it into my own pocket that morning without thinking. Now it anchored me like a weight. The chatter in the room was starting again. A few awkward laughs. Melissa, my daughter, looked confused but didn't speak. Evan, my youngest, sat frozen halfway through a sip of water. My eyes moved slowly around the table, taking in the scene. The china plates, the silverware I had polished that morning, the flickering candles, and my son standing there, acting as though I were a guest, overstaying my welcome. I placed my fork gently on the plate. I pushed my chair back and stood. I could feel Lydia's hand slip away from my shoulder. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I walked toward the front door. The autumn air was cool against my face as I stepped onto the porch. My hands were steady when I took out my phone. "Daniel," I said when he picked up, my voice low but certain. "Plan B. Now." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then his answer came, firm and immediate. "On my way." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The handkerchief was still there, warm now from my grip. Behind me, through the closed door, I could hear Greg's voice rising, selling his plan to the room. The words were muffled, but the tone was sharp, persuasive, confident. He thought this was already done. Down the street, at the small coffee shop, on the corner, Daniel Moore and Carol, my oldest friend, were sitting with paper cups in front of them. I had told them to be nearby tonight, just in case. Just in case this exact moment came. From where I stood, I could see them through the shop's front window. Carol glanced up from her coffee and met my eyes across the distance. She didn't need me to wave. She was already on her feet. Daniel gathered a slim leather portfolio from the table. The two of them stepped out into the night, walking quickly toward my house. I stayed on the porch, one hand on the railing, breathing in the cool air. In less than 10 minutes, their footsteps would cross the threshold, and inside, the voices would get louder, sharper. There would be shouting, the kind that comes when the ground under someone's feet is suddenly pulled away. At my late husband's birthday, my son announced, "Pack your bags, old lady. This house is going up for sale." Everyone cheered and raised their glasses. I stepped outside and made one phone call. 10 minutes later, the screaming started. I am 67 years old. For most of my adult life, I have worked as a part-time accountant at the same small firm in town. Numbers have always made sense to me. People, not always. My real work, the one I never got paid for, was keeping this red brick house running. It was the center of my marriage, my motherhood, my entire rhythm of living. Frank and I bought the house in 1979. Back then, it needed work, flaking paint, cracked steps, a yard overrun with weeds, but Frank could see past all that. He said it had good bones. We spent that first summer on ladders, sanding and painting, with the radio playing in the background. By fall, it was ours in every way that mattered. Frank loved that yard. He planted a row of irises along the side fence the year our first child was born. He said they were stubborn flowers, the kind that returned no matter how cold the winter. I can still see him out there in an old flannel shirt, dirt on his hands, coaxing those bulbs into the soil. Every spring since, they've come back, tall and purple, just like he promised. Inside, he had his spot, the brown leather armchair by the window in the living room. Morning after morning, he sat there with his coffee, the newspaper folded neatly in his lap. He had a way of reading headlines and shaking his head, a little sigh escaping before he turned the page. That chair is still here. Sometimes I swear it holds the shape of him. We raised 3 children in this house. Greg, the oldest, is 42 now. He works as a construction project manager in the city. Ambitious, polished, always talking about the next big move. He's the one who makes plans without asking who they affect. He can charm a room if it serves him, but when it comes to family, charm turns into control. Melissa is 39. She teaches music at the elementary school and has 2 kids of her own. Her life is a constant shuffle between lesson plans, soccer practices, and keeping her marriage from fraying. She doesn't make waves. If Greg speaks loudly enough, she tends to let him take the lead. Then there's Evan, my youngest at 34. He owns a small auto repair shop a few miles away. Evan is steady, like his father was. He checks in, asks how I'm doing, shows up with groceries when he knows I've been too busy or too tired to shop. He never liked conflict, but he's not afraid to stand beside me when I need someone in my corner. Frank used to tell me, if you want to keep something, don't just hold it with your hands, hold it with legal rights. At the time, I thought it was just about making sure the mortgage was in both our names, or that our wills were signed and notarized. But over the years, I've learned he meant more than that. He meant that love and trust are precious. But when it comes to protecting your home, your security, you can't rely on goodwill alone. After Frank passed last year, I found myself carrying that sentence in my head like a compass. I kept up with the property taxes. I double-checked the paperwork on the deed. I even had quiet conversations with Daniel, our longtime attorney, just to make sure I understood exactly where I stood. That's why tonight, when Greg stood up at that table and announced the sale as if it were already done, the words didn't hit me like a surprise. They landed like something I had been bracing for. His timing on Frank's birthday was cruel, but not random. Greg has been circling the idea of unlocking equity in this house for months. He sees square footage, not the 34 Christmas mornings spent in this living room. In that moment, Holding Frank's handkerchief in my pocket, I thought about the irises, how they come back each year, not because they're wanted, but because they are rooted, deep, quietly determined. I thought about Frank in his chair, telling me that love and legal rights aren't enemies, they're allies. So I stepped outside. I called Daniel, and I asked him to set Plan B in motion. What Greg didn't know, and what he was about to find out, is that this red brick house is not just a place where I live. It is a place I own, in every sense of the word. And I have no intention of being pushed out of it with a toast and a smirk. The autumn air was sharp against my cheeks, but I felt steady. Inside, laughter was picking up again, but it had a hollow sound now. The night was about to shift, and I was ready. It started not long after Frank's funeral. The casseroles from neighbors were still stacked in the freezer, and the sympathy cards sat in a neat pile on the kitchen counter. Greg began stopping by more often, always in the evenings when the shadows were long and the house felt too big. He would sit at the table, clasp his hands, and say things like, "Mom, we should talk about your future, a safe future. This place is a lot to manage on your own." At first, I thought he meant well. Losing Frank had left me untethered, and maybe Greg just wanted to help anchor me. But then, the conversations took on a certain weight. He started using words like liquidate and maximize assets, as if he were running a boardroom meeting instead of talking to his mother in her own kitchen. "A retirement community could give you everything you need," he said one night. "Meals, medical care, people your own age." I knew better. Those places are for people who are done living in their homes, not for someone who still plants spring bulbs and files her own taxes. A week later, he brought Lydia. She's polished, mid-30s, always in tailored jackets and perfect hair. The kind of smile that shows every tooth, but somehow doesn't warm her eyes. She handed me a box of bakery cookies and strolled through the living room as if she'd been invited to appraise it. Her gaze moved from the grandfather clock Frank inherited from his uncle to the walnut dining set we bought our first Christmas. "Charming," she said, but her tone made it sound like a category on a real estate listing. I noticed the way Greg watched her, almost like they were silently tallying value. It made my stomach knot. 2 days later, my neighbor Mrs. Turner stopped me by the mailbox. "Abigail," she said, lowering her voice, "there was a man in your yard yesterday. Long tape measure, clipboard. Not one of your kids?" I shook my head. That evening, I saw for myself. Lydia stood on the front walk with a tall man in a navy blazer, the kind who wears loafers without socks. He was holding a tablet, angling it toward the porch. The late light caught on the gold badge pinned to his lapel, Earl Benton Realty. I didn't bother going inside first. I walked right up to them. "Taking an interest in my hydrangeas?" I asked. Earl shifted, but Lydia smiled that wide, cool smile. "Just helping Greg explore some options for you," she said, as if she were discussing paint colors. I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch until Earl glanced at his watch and murmured something about another appointment. They left without taking any more pictures. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. I thought about Frank again, about that line he used to say, the one I carried like a shield. "If you want to keep something, don't just hold it with your hands, hold it with legal rights." I knew I had paperwork in order, but I also knew Greg could be persistent. The next morning, I called Carol. She and I met in bookkeeping night classes decades ago, back when our kids were in grade school. She'd lost her husband 5 years earlier and had learned the hard way that family doesn't always honor what's fair. Over coffee at her kitchen island, I told her about Greg, about Lydia, about Earl with his clipboard. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was already running through solutions. "You need a trust," she said finally. "Not just a will, not just a deed in your name. A living trust. That way, no one can rush you or accidentally sign something on your behalf. You decide who benefits and when. And if Greg's in a hurry, well, too bad for him." I laughed once, short and humorless. He's not going to like it. Carol's mouth quirked in that half smile I've always admired. Good. This isn't about what he likes. It's about you keeping what's yours. Walking home, I noticed the irises along the fence had started to yellow at the edges. Summer was ending. I thought about how Greg and Lydia had looked at this house, not as a home, but as a transaction. And I decided Carol was right. I wasn't going to wait for the next surprise visit. It was time to make sure my roots went deeper than any of their plans. Carol didn't waste time. 2 days after our coffee, she called and said, "I've set up a meeting for you. His name's Daniel Hughes. He handled my trust after Mark passed. Quiet, thorough, no patience for family drama." We met at his office on Main Street, a modest brick building with blinds half drawn and a brass plaque by the door. Daniel looked to be in his late 40s, clean-shaven, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who speaks only when he has something worth saying. He shook my hand firmly and gestured to a seat. Carol stayed with me, arms folded, like a sentry. I explained what was happening: Greg's visits, Lydia's interest in the house, Earl with his tablet. Daniel listened without interrupting, jotting notes in a neat, looping hand. When I finished, he tapped his pen once on the legal pad. "We'll set up a revocable living trust. We'll call it the Turner Family Trust. You'll be the primary trustee with full control while you're alive. I recommend appointing a co-trustee you trust implicitly, someone who can step in if you're incapacitated." "Evan," I said without hesitation. "My youngest, my steady one. He might not make much running the repair shop, but he's never asked for more than a Sunday dinner and a smile." Daniel nodded. "Done. Once the property is transferred into the trust, no one, not Greg, not anyone, can sell it without both trustees' signatures, and I'd strongly suggest revoking any power of attorney you've previously granted." The truth stung. Years ago, when Frank had his knee surgery, we'd made Greg a durable POA, just in case. It had seemed practical at the time. Now it felt like leaving the back door unlocked with a fox in the henhouse. Daniel slid a form across the desk. "Sign here to revoke it. I'll handle the notification." I signed, my pen steady. Carol reached over and gave my wrist a small squeeze. By the end of the afternoon, the trust documents were drawn, the house and land folded under its umbrella. Daniel placed the originals into a slim manila folder and slipped them into a fireproof envelope. "I'll store the originals in my safe," he said. "You'll get certified copies. Keep one in a secure place, and I recommend installing discrete security cameras. 2 front, 2 back. No need to advertise them." I followed his advice to the letter. The next day, a polite young man from a local security company came and wired the cameras, tucking them under eaves and beside downspouts. I didn't tell Greg, or anyone else besides Evan, what I'd done. When Daniel handed me the small silver key to the bank's safe deposit box where one certified copy would be stored, it felt heavier than it should. Smooth, cool, unassuming, yet it held my future. I slipped it onto a plain keyring and kept it in my pocket, the way some people carry a lucky charm. Only this wasn't luck. This was law. That night, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the front window. The camera's tiny lights blinked faintly, invisible unless you knew where to look. The house was quiet, the air still. For the first time in weeks, I felt a layer of calm settle over me. Frank's voice came back to me. If you want to keep something, don't just hold it with your hands, hold it with legal rights. I closed my fingers around that key in my pocket and realized I was holding both. About a month before the birthday gathering, the phone rang just after dinner. I was rinsing plates when Melissa's name lit up the screen. "Hi, honey," I said, drying my hands. There was a pause, then her voice, lighter than usual but edged with something. "Mom, can we talk for a minute? Greg's been saying, well, that you've been forgetting things, misplacing bills, leaving the stove on." I could hear a faint clatter in the background, and then the high, bright giggle of her youngest. My chest tightened. "Is that Emma?" I asked. Melissa's voice softened. "Yeah, she's building a fort in the living room." The sound of that little laugh should have warmed me, but instead it underscored the distance. My own granddaughter, just a few towns away, yet I was more familiar with her voice over a phone line than with her hugs. I tried to keep my tone even. "Honey, I'm fine. I keep my own books, balance my checkbook every month, and I haven't left the stove on since you were in high school." "I know, Mom," she said quickly. "It's just..." Greg sounded really concerned. He said maybe we should think about, planning ahead. Planning ahead. The same phrase Greg had used in my kitchen last week, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. I could almost hear his voice coming through hers. In my head, a list started forming. Moments Melissa had pulled away over the years. Not in a cruel way, but in the way life tugs at people. A new baby, a new job, her own mortgage. Yet now, with Greg feeding her this story, I felt something sharper. Not just absence, but doubt. I swallowed. "Melissa, I raised 3 kids while keeping the books for your father's business, and later for 2 more companies. If I can still tell you the exact date property taxes are due and which cupboard the extra sugar is in, I think my mind's doing just fine." There was another pause, then a sigh. "Okay, I worry about you." We said our goodbyes, and I stood for a long while in the kitchen, phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet. The clock ticked steadily above the stove, a sound that used to comfort me. That night, it sounded like something counting down. It wasn't just that Greg was circling the house. Now he was planting seeds of doubt in my own daughter's mind. And the part that hurt most was realizing how easily they might take root. The morning of the gathering, I woke earlier than usual. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from the night before. I pulled out the heavy Dutch oven Frank used to favor, running my fingers over the worn handle before setting it on the stove. Beef stew, slow-cooked with red potatoes and carrots, had been his favorite, and I wanted the house to smell like those winters when we'd host friends after church. As the meat browned, I dug out an old cassette from the drawer by the fridge. Frank's voice crackled through the speaker, him laughing at some long-forgotten joke. I let it play low while I chopped vegetables, the sound filling the empty spaces like sunlight through a thin curtain. On the dining table, I placed our wedding album. open to a photo of us under the arbor, my veil lifting in the wind. By 2 o'clock, the stew was simmering and the house felt warm, almost safe. Greg arrived first, wearing a sports jacket too tight across his shoulders. Lydia followed, a flash of perfume and sharp heels. Earl, the realtor, trailed behind them, holding a bottle of wine like it was an offering. "Mom," Greg said, leaning in for a quick hug. His eyes scanned the room before his arms even left my shoulders. Lydia smiled wide, her hand resting lightly on Greg's arm. "The house looks lovely," she said, but her gaze flitted to the crown molding, the framed photo above the mantel. I noticed Earl hang back, taking in the space with the same detached interest a man might give a car lot. Melissa came next, a little out of breath, carrying a store-bought cake. She kissed my cheek quickly, murmured something about traffic, and then went to fuss over the kids who had slipped in behind her. From the kitchen doorway, the threshold, I watched them all mingle. Lydia drifted toward Earl, their heads close, voices low. Earl gestured toward the back window, and Lydia nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I stood there, framed in the doorway, one hand resting on the wood. It was a stance I'd taken 100 times before, looking in on a room full of family and friends, wondering whether to join or just keep watching. Today, that hesitation felt heavier. Greg called out from the living room, "Mom, come in here, will you?" But I lingered a moment longer, my feet just shy of the carpet. From where I stood, I can see the stew pot in the kitchen, steam rising steadily. I could hear Frank's laugh still playing softly from the cassette, almost drowned by the chatter in the other room. It struck me that this threshold, was more than a doorway. It was a choice. Step in and pretend nothing was shifting under my feet, or stay here and start deciding how I was going to hold my ground. Greg stood up halfway through dessert, his wine glass in hand. The hum of conversation quieted, and every head turned toward him. He tapped the rim with a spoon, the sound sharp against the room's soft edges. "I have an announcement," he said, smiling as though he were about to toast a promotion. "Mom has decided it's time to downsize. This house will be on the market by spring. We want her somewhere safe, comfortable, less to take care of." My fork froze midair. Across the table, Earl shifted forward, sliding a leather portfolio onto the polished wood. The clasp popped open, and I caught the edge of a glossy brochure. Photos of my kitchen, my garden, my bedroom. My hands tightened in my lap. A smattering of polite claps broke out around the table. Melissa's were tentative, eyes flicking to me, but Lydia's were bright and confident, as if she were applauding a performance she'd been waiting for. My stomach churned. The people who had eaten my food, sat at my table, were now cheering the idea of me packing my life into boxes. The air thickened, voices blending into a muted roar in my ears. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the soft cotton of Frank's handkerchief. It was still folded the way I'd kept it since the funeral. Corners worn smooth. The simple pressure of it under my fingers anchored me. Frank's voice came back to me, low and steady. "If you want to keep something, Abby, don't just hold it in your hands. Hold it in a way they can't take." I set my fork down with deliberate care, the metal barely making a sound against the plate. Standing, I smoothed the front of my sweater, the handkerchief still pressed to my palm. The chatter dulled as I stepped back from the table, skirting the edge of the room. Out on the porch, the winter air met me like a bracing slap. I closed the door behind me and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers moved without hesitation. Daniel, I said when he picked up, my voice low but clear. Plan B, now. From the street, I saw movement at the corner cafe. Daniel and Carol rose from their table, leaving their coffee half finished, and started walking toward my house with purpose in their stride. Inside, through the dining room window, I could see Greg still talking, gesturing toward Earl's papers. Lydia leaned in, nodding. They didn't notice I was gone. Not yet. The front door opened without a knock, and every conversation in the dining room stalled. Daniel stepped in first, tall and calm in his dark coat, followed by Carol, her expression unreadable but steady. They didn't hesitate. They walked straight to my side as I re-entered from the porch, the cold still clinging to my sweater. Daniel placed a slim folder on the table, sliding Earl's portfolio aside like it was nothing more than a misplaced menu. I'm Daniel Foster, Mrs. Turner's attorney, he said evenly. Before any further discussion about this property continues, there's something you all should know. Greg leaned back in his chair, his smile tight. Daniel, right? You might want to slow down. We've got this handled. Daniel ignored him, flipping open the folder to reveal crisp legal documents. The Turner Family Trust was established 6 weeks ago. The house and land are held by that trust. Abigail Turner is the primary trustee. Evan Turner is the co-trustee. No sale, lease, or encumbrance can proceed without their joint consent. A ripple of murmurs moved around the table. Earl's face lost some of its color. Lydia's smile faltered, eyes darting between Greg and the folder. Greg's voice sharpened. That's interesting, but you're forgetting something. I have a new power of attorney for Mom, signed just last month. I can make these decisions. Daniel didn't flinch. He reached into the folder again, pulling out a single page, placing it directly in front of Greg. You mean this? His voice stayed calm, but each word landed with weight. Dated December 2nd, the same day Mrs. Turner was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital for a diagnostic scan, heavily sedated, under medical observation from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. He let that hang in the air before continuing. There are 2 witnesses, both hospital staff, prepared to testify she could not have knowingly signed anything that day. The silence was sharp now, the kind that makes every breath sound too loud. Greg's jaw tightened. You're twisting things. Carol finally spoke, her tone cool but unshakable. No, Greg, you've been twisting them. For months. From my place beside Daniel, I let my hand rest on the edge of the table, close to the wedding album I'd set out earlier. My fingers brushed the page with Frank's smile, and I felt the weight of the room shift, just slightly, away from Greg's control. No one clapped this time. Carol didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small digital recorder, setting it gently on the table. Before anyone pretends we're all misunderstanding each other, she said, pressing play, let's listen. The sound that filled the dining room wasn't music or small talk. It was Lydia's voice, unmistakable, clipped, and businesslike. If we close by March, Earl, your cut's secure. Greg promised me 10% for moving this along. Earl's laugh followed, low and smug. You'll get it. Once she's out, the listing goes live. I already have buyers interested in tearing down the back lot. The recording clicked off. Melissa's fork clattered against her plate. Lydia, you... She turned on Greg, her face pale. Did you forge Mom's signature? Her voice broke on the last word. Greg opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His eyes darted toward Lydia, whose lipstick smile had vanished entirely. Earl shifted in his chair, looking suddenly very interested in his watch. Evan was the one who spoke next, his voice steady, but weighted with something deeper than anger. I thought you wanted to help Mom, Greg. I thought all those talks about her future were real. He shook his head slowly. Turns out you just wanted her gone. I stayed quiet, letting their words hang in the air. My fingers found the edge of Frank's handkerchief in my pocket, the fabric worn soft from years of folding and refolding. It grounded me, reminded me of every small fight we'd weathered together. Fights where truth eventually won, even if it took time. The room had shifted again. This time the silence wasn't mine to carry. Greg finally found his voice, leaning forward with his palms flat on the table as if trying to anchor himself. "This isn't what it sounds like," he said, his tone defensive, but trembling underneath. "Everything I've done, every conversation with Lydia and Earl, it was for you, Mom, for your care. I didn't want you to end up alone, struggling when you could be in a place where professionals could take care of you. That's all this was about, making sure you'd be safe." I kept my eyes on him, steady and unflinching. "Safe," I repeated, tasting the word. "You call taking my home, the place your father built, the garden he planted for me, safety." He swallowed hard. "I was thinking ahead. I didn't want you to get hurt, or worse, for something to happen when no one was here. You've been forgetful sometimes." There it was, the quiet accusation Melissa had hinted at weeks earlier. I let the pause stretch, felt every eye in the room shift between us. Then I said, softly but with a weight that made him look up, "You're worried I'll lose face. I'm worried I'll lose myself." The words hung there like a bell still ringing. A few chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands instead, tracing the edge of a napkin, like a boy caught lying about breaking a window. "I have managed this home for decades," I continued, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Through winters when the furnace failed, through hospital bills when your father's back gave out, through every choice that meant less for me so there could be more for you three. Not once did I need a salesman to tell me how to protect what I love." Greg's shoulders hunched. Lydia glanced toward the door as if calculating how quickly she could leave without drawing attention. "I'm still here," I said, leaning in slightly. "I'm still your mother, and I know the difference between help and harm." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind you could feel in your bones. No clinking glasses, no whispers. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant creak of the old house settling, as if it too were listening. Greg didn't meet my eyes again, and I didn't offer him an escape. Greg pushed back his chair so abruptly it scraped against the hardwood. Without another word, he stalked toward the door, his jaw tight and his footsteps loud against the silence. Lydia's eyes darted after him before she let out a small, tremulous sob, dabbing delicately at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, as if the fabric might dissolve her guilt. Her mascara held perfectly. The performance was for the room. Earl shifted awkwardly beside her, his portfolio now tucked under his arm like contraband. I've got another appointment," he mumbled, already backing away. No one stopped him. He slipped out the side door, the faint sound of his car starting a relief to everyone still gathered. I stood still, watching the dust of their departure settle, my hand instinctively touching the corner of my pocket, where Frank's handkerchief waited. a reminder of the calm he always carried into moments like this. Melissa was the first to cross the invisible gap between us. Her heels clicked slowly on the floor until she was standing right in front of me. Her eyes were damp, but it wasn't the shallow gloss of Lydia's act. This was something heavier. Shame, maybe, or the sting of realizing too late where loyalty should have been. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. I believed him. I thought he was doing what was best for you. I didn't ask questions. I should have. I'm so sorry." I studied her face for a moment, the face I'd kissed goodnight thousands of times. The same eyes that had looked up at me from the school stage when she played the piano at 9 years old. "The important thing," I said quietly, my voice steady, "is that you're here, now." I squeezed her hand, feeling the small tremor there, and hoped she felt the steadiness in mine. Her shoulders sagged, like she had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally let it go. She nodded, unable to say more, and for a few seconds, it was just the two of us in the room. The others blurred to the edges. Around us, the party had dissolved into murmurs, guests finding excuses to leave, coats slipping on, polite nods exchanged without lingering eye contact. The laughter and music from earlier seemed like a different lifetime, replaced by the low hum of awkward departure. As Melissa and I stood together, I realized the war wasn't over, but the battle tonight had been mine to win. Not by shouting, not by matching their schemes with fury, but by holding my ground with the quiet certainty Frank had always admired. Greg could leave with his pride bruised. Lydia could cry her crocodile tears. Earl could vanish into the night. But the house, the life Frank and I built, was still in my hands. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the air in my lungs expand without the weight of fear pressing in. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was standing. The days that followed felt like moving through the aftermath of a storm. The house was still standing, but there was debris, emotional and otherwise, scattered everywhere. Daniel came by the very next morning, a leather folder under his arm, his voice calm but decisive as he walked me through each page. He had already filed the paperwork to block any sale attempts. Every transaction tied to the property was frozen unless my signature and Evan's, as co-trustee, appeared together. Earl's name, Daniel told me, had surfaced in 2 other questionable property deals, and there was now a quiet but firm investigation underway. Lydia packed her things 3 days later. I didn't see her leave. Evan said she came by while I was at the grocery store. I found her perfume lingering faintly in the hallway, but her shoes were gone from the mudroom, her coat missing from the hook. She didn't leave a note. Greg stayed silent. No calls, no visits. I suppose I should have expected that. His absence didn't hurt the way I thought it might. Instead, it was like closing a door that had been hanging open during a cold night. There was still a draft, but I knew it would fade. Daniel stopped by again that Friday, this time with a few small items for me to sign. "These will make sure no lender or buyer can touch your house without going through the trust," he said, sliding the papers toward me. His efficiency was a comfort. Every line he drew, every stamp he pressed, felt like bricks being laid in a wall I could lean on. That weekend, Melissa arrived with the kids. She didn't call ahead, just showed up on the porch with a pie in her hands, her hair windblown, cheeks flushed from the cold. "We thought we'd spend the afternoon here," she said, her voice tentative but warmer than it had been in months. The children tumbled inside, their laughter filling spaces that had been too quiet lately. We played a board game Frank used to love, The kind where the rules made no sense, but the competition was fierce. Melissa sat beside me on the couch after, helping me fold laundry while the kids built a pillow fort in the den. It wasn't lost on me how different the air felt with them here. Not heavy, not watchful, just home. By Monday, the rhythm of my days had shifted. There were still legal letters to read, documents to file, and occasional updates from Daniel, but there was also the sound of my kettle whistling in the morning, the sight of the irises in the garden pushing through the soil, the feeling of my own steps echoing on the hardwood floors Frank and I had once varnished together. The trust was more than a legal shield now. It was a line in the sand, a declaration. This was still my home, still my life, and I intended to live it on my own terms. I sat at the kitchen table late in the evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. A single lamp lit the page in front of me. The paper was thick, the kind Frank always preferred for anything worth keeping. I picked up my pen and began to write. Greg, I have replayed the past few months in my mind more times than I care to admit. I keep wondering where we crossed the line from family to strangers. You were my first child. I remember the night you were born, the way your tiny fingers wrapped around mine, as if you already knew I was the one who would keep you safe. That memory has not faded, even after all that has happened. Trust is not something given without cost. It is built, slowly, with truth and care, and it can be broken in a single moment. You took that from me when you chose to act without my consent, when you let ambition speak louder than love. I am not angry in the way you think. Anger burns fast and bright, and then it is gone. What I feel is colder, steadier, a boundary. That boundary now stands between us, not to punish you, but to protect what I have left. I will always wish you well, Greg. I will always remember the boy you were, the one who laughed with his father in the garden, the one who helped me bring in the groceries without being asked. But I cannot let that memory blind me to the man you are now. If you ever want to rebuild trust, it will not be through words, but through actions over time. Until then, my life will move forward, and it will be mine. I set the pen down and read the letter twice. There was no satisfaction in it, only clarity. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into an envelope without sealing it, and tucked it into the back of the desk drawer. It wasn't meant to be sent. Some things are better left unsaid to the person they're about, yet said fully to yourself. Sitting there, I realized forgiveness and protection are not the same. Forgiveness can be silent, private. Protection must be visible, firm. I could forgive him in my heart, but that didn't mean I had to open the door again. The lamp cast a warm circle of light on the table. Beyond it, the rest of the house was in shadow. I got up, turned the light off, and let the darkness settle, carrying with me the quiet certainty that my boundaries were not walls of bitterness. They were gates I chose when and for whom to open. The afternoon sun was warm, but not heavy, the kind of light Frank used to call honest daylight. I stood on the porch steps, sleeves rolled to my elbows, watching Evan haul 2 buckets of white paint toward the fence at the edge of the garden. The old wooden slats had been leaning for years, weathered to a gray that made the irises behind them look even more vivid. Frank had promised me he'd get around to painting it before the petals fell for the season. That season had passed 3 times since. Evan set the buckets down with a thud and grinned. "Figured it was about time we made good on Dad's promise," he said. I handed him a brush, its bristles soft from years of use, and we worked side by side without speaking at first. The rhythm of dipping and brushing was steady, the scent of fresh paint mixing with the faint perfume of the flowers. After a while, Evan broke the silence. You know, Dad used to stand here in the evenings, right by this fence. Said this spot gave him the best view of the whole yard. I smiled, the image coming easily. Frank leaning on the top rail, coffee mug in hand, surveying the garden like it was a kingdom he'd built. He said the same to me. I replied, though I think he mostly liked that he could see me through the kitchen window. Evan chuckled, and for a moment it felt like the weight of the past months loosened. But then his expression grew more serious. Mom, I know I haven't said it out loud, but I'm proud of how you handled everything. You didn't shout. You didn't slam doors. You just stood your ground. I think Dad would have been proud, too. The words settled over me like the warmth of the sun, steady and quiet. I kept brushing the paint on in long strokes, letting the silence stretch before I answered. Your father always said there's more strength in stillness than in noise. I didn't understand that when I was younger. But now, I think he was right. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means staying rooted, like these irises, even when someone tries to dig you out. Evan leaned on his brush and looked toward the flowers. They come back every year, he said softly, even after winters that look like they've killed everything. That's the thing about roots, I said. You can't always see them, but they're there, holding on. We worked for another hour, finishing the fence in sections until the boards gleamed white against the green stems. Evan stepped back to admire our work. Looks good, he said. Better than I thought it would. It's not perfect, I replied, but it's ours, and it's standing. Before he left, Evan touched the top rail of the fence and glanced at me. If Greg ever comes around, I'll be here. You won't have to stand alone again. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. After he drove away, I stayed by the fence a little longer, running my fingers over the smooth paint. The irises swayed gently in the breeze, their petals brushing the new boards like a quiet thank you. In that moment, I realized the fence wasn't just a promise Frank had left undone. It was a symbol of the things we build, the things we protect, and the quiet ways we keep standing, year after year. The kettle began its soft whistle just as the late afternoon light turned the kitchen golden. I reached for Frank's old ceramic mug, the one with the tiny chip along the rim, and set a tea bag inside. The mug was heavier than it looked, shaped perfectly to fit between my palms. As the water poured, steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the scent of chamomile through the air. I crossed to the old cassette player on the counter and pressed play. A faint static came first, then his voice. Frank's low chuckle, followed by a short burst of laughter that made my chest ache in the gentlest way. I let the sound fill the kitchen while I stirred the tea, the spoon tapping against the mug in slow, steady beats. Carrying the mug, I stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under my feet, familiar as an old lullaby. Beyond the railing, the irises swayed in the breeze, their violet petals deepened by the sinking sun. My gaze fell to the small brass key in my other hand, the trust's safe deposit key. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling its ridges, its solid weight. That key wasn't just metal. It was proof that my life, my home, and my choices were my own. I lowered myself into Frank's rocking chair, the one we'd bought together at a yard sale 30 years ago. It groaned as I leaned back, sipping the tea, listening to his laughter fade into the soft hum of the cassette tape turning. For a while, I just breathed. Tea in one hand, key in the other, and the garden spread before me like a quiet promise kept. The threshold motif came to me again, not in a flash, but as a gentle knowing. I set the mug down, rose from the chair, and walked toward the doorway that opened from the porch into the yard. My bare feet touched the wooden frame, and I paused there, hand resting on the post. The same frame I had stood in so many times before, sometimes hesitant, sometimes braced for battle. This time, there was no hesitation. I stepped down into the garden. The grass felt cool and alive beneath my feet, the air holding that end-of-day warmth. The irises seemed taller up close, their blooms tilting slightly toward me as if in greeting. I reached out to brush one petal with my fingertips, its texture silkier than I remembered. For a moment, I imagined Frank standing beside me, both of us watching the garden grow, unhurried. I thought of Evan painting the fence, of Melissa's hand squeezing mine in apology, of Carol's steady voice, of Daniel's sharp precision. And I thought of Greg, how absence can be just as defining as presence. I closed my eyes and whispered, not to the flowers, not to Frank, not even to myself, but to the quiet air that seemed to hold it all. I'm still here. Opening my eyes, I turned back toward the house. From the garden, the porch looked like a steadfast sentinel, watching over everything. I climbed the steps again, took my seat, and lifted Frank's mug to my lips. The tea was cooler now, but it tasted stronger somehow. The cassette clicked off. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, layered with memory, with roots that went deeper than any storm could touch. I let it wrap around me as the day shifted toward evening, knowing I had crossed the threshold for the last time as someone who feared losing her place. Now, I simply belonged. I could still hear Frank's voice as clearly as if he were sitting right beside me. He had said it more than once, always in that calm, matter-of-fact way of his. Never as a warning, but as a truth worth carrying. If you want to keep something, don't just hold it in your hands. Hold it in your legal right. At the time, I had thought he was talking about deeds and titles, maybe even about the car we'd worked so hard to pay off. But now, standing here years later, I understood he had meant more than that. The sun had dipped low, casting the yard in that honeyed light that makes every shadow seem softer. I ran my fingers along the edge of the trust key resting on the porch rail. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they were sure. That key, those papers in the safe deposit box, they weren't just about the house or the land. They were about my right to decide who I was and what I would allow in my life. I took a slow breath, remembering the first night after Frank's funeral, when Greg had started talking about selling. I'd sat at this very table, clutching my mug, trying to make sense of a world that felt tilted without Frank's steadying presence. I had been afraid then, afraid of losing my home, of losing control, of losing myself in other people's decisions. I wasn't afraid anymore. From inside, I could hear the faint murmur of Melissa's laughter as she helped the kids with their board game. The sound carried through the open window, threading into the evening air like something woven to last. Evan's truck was still in the driveway, the faint scent of paint from the new fence lingering. Life had shifted. Some ties had frayed, some had strengthened, and I had chosen which to tend and which to let go. I stepped into the yard, the grass cool against my ankles, the irises bowing slightly as the breeze caught them. I thought again of Frank's words. If you want to keep something. My smile came slowly, almost shy at first, then grew until it felt steady and warm. I had kept the house. I had kept the garden. I had kept my dignity. And I had done it the way Frank would have approved of. Quietly, legally, with a clear head and a steady hand. I whispered into the air as if speaking to him. I kept it, Frank. On paper. And in myself. For a while, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle over me. There was no urge to rush, no need to fill the space with words or noise. This was the kind of ending I had not known to wish for. Not a grand declaration, not a public vindication, but a private peace that fit perfectly inside my own life. As I turned to walk back toward the porch, I glanced over my shoulder at the house, its brick walls glowing in the fading light. It didn't look like a prize or a possession. It looked like home, because it was. I crossed the threshold one last time that day, feeling the frame against my fingertips, and sat down in Frank's chair. The key rested beside me on the table, catching the last spark of sunlight before the day gave way to night. I wrapped my hands around my mug, breathed in the tea's gentle steam, and let the moment fill me. Frank had been right. I had kept what mattered. Not just the walls and the roof, but the woman who lived within them. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I was truly, entirely, unshakably home. The late afternoon light stretched across the porch, soft and golden, the kind of light that makes even old wood look warm. I stood at the edge of the garden, watching the irises sway. They caught the breeze the same way they always had when Frank was here, but now their motion seemed to carry something more, a quiet knowing, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. I let the moment sink in, feeling its weight, its peace. I turned, slowly, my eyes meeting the camera as if I were looking into someone else's living room, someone who might understand. My voice was calm, but there was steel under the softness. Have you ever had to stand up and protect the one thing that mattered most? Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because you knew it was the line between losing yourself and keeping who you are? If you have, I'd like to hear your story. Leave it for me. Let's keep each other's company in these truths. Some of you might be watching with a hot cup of coffee in the quiet of morning. Others, maybe in the stillness of night, when stories like this feel heavier, closer. However you've come here, know that I'm listening. We read every comment with gratitude. If this story touched your heart, I'd be glad for you to stay. Subscribe, so you can hear more stories like this. Not just to listen, but to be part of a place where kindness still matters, where healing is possible, where second chances aren't just words. We can hold that space together. I glanced back at the garden one more time. The irises bowed to the breeze again, as if to say they'd been here before and would be here after, rooted and sure. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. Sometimes it waits quietly, patient, until you're ready to open your heart and let it in. The music under my voice was soft, just a thread of piano and strings, wrapping around the silence instead of breaking it. I stepped away from the camera's gaze, the frame widening until it caught only the garden, the fence Evan had painted, and the flowers moving gently. The light thinned as the day gave way to evening. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next story. And until then, stand steady at your own threshold, knowing what you'll keep and how you'll keep it. The last image lingered. The irises, their violet petals trembling ever so slightly in the fading light. Then the screen faded to black,